An hour of intense fighting at the borders of the Wheatfield had resulted in the Confederates finally taking a tenuous foothold. After an initial unsuccessful assault by G.T. Anderson's brigade of Hood's division, Longstreet's corps, Anderson regrouped and was joined in a second assault by Kershaw's brigade from McLaws' division. And this time they also had additional help on the right from 3 intermixed regiments of Robertson's and Benning's brigades. Together, the rebels pushed back to the northern edge of the Wheatfield, de Trobriand's brigade, and 2 regiments of Burling's brigade, both from the 3rd Corps, as well as Tilton's and Schweitzer's brigades from the 5th Corps. The Confederates also forced 2 sections of Winslow's battery to limber up and leave. But the status quo was about to change, as Union reinforcements were mere minutes away. The video is extracted from over 40 hours of animation, covering the entire Gettysburg battlefield on July 1st and 2nd. For more information about this acclaimed work, visit the website referenced above. 4 regiments of Anderson's brigade, now commanded by William Luffman after Anderson was wounded, had just tentatively crossed over the stone wall at the southern border of the Wheatfield. On their right were the 3rd Arkansas and 1st Texas of Robertson's brigade, intermixed with the 15th Georgia of Benning's brigade. Kershaw's right-wing regiments, the 7th and 3rd South Carolina, were perched atop the Stony Hill, targeting Winslow's remaining right battery section. On the Union side, the 120 or so men of the 115th Pennsylvania, who had charged Kershaw twice in support of Winslow, were now out of ammunition and began their withdrawal behind the departing last battery section. With Devil's Den to the south and the Wheatfield now devoid of Union troops, and the entire left wing of Sickles' line collapsing, General Birney, in command of the division in the wing, had to act quickly. Harry Faunce writes in his book, Gettysburg the Second Day, quote, "Birney must have known that Caldwell's division was on the way and thought it necessary to buy time. He saw the 17th Maine standing in line in the Wheatfield, catching its breath and waiting for ammunition. Birney rode up to Lieutenant Colonel Merrill of the 17th and ordered the regiment forward to buy a little time." Unquote. The rebels saw the advancing Union line and scurried back over the stone wall for cover. Next, Birney found the 5th Michigan and now ordered them to advance and support the 17th Maine. The 2 weary regiments took up a position in the middle of the Wheatfield, and they were raked by fire from Kershaw to the right and Luffman to the front. But they succeeded in thwarting any further rebel advance into the field, and gave Caldwell the needed time to arrive and begin his deployment. Cross's was the 1st Brigade of Hancock's 2nd Corps to arrive at the Wheatfield to reinforce the crumbling Union left. The deployment of Cross's, as well as the other 3 brigades of Caldwell's division, was unconventional because of the expeditious manner in which the division hastened to the south from Cemetery Ridge, near the Hummelbow farm lane. Author Harry Faunce described the movement, writing, quote, "Instead of taking the time necessary to file off by regiment, with the right of each one in its lead, the whole division moved at one time. The brigade commanders simply faced their brigades to the left and moved them off in 4 brigade blocks, or chunks, as one soldier called them." Unquote. When Cross's chunk of soldiers arrived at the Wheatfield Road, the right column, the 61st New York, filed to the right along the roadside fence. The rest of the regiments followed suit. The awkward movement placed the regiment's right, which had become the trailing end of each regiment, on its left. And when the regiment subsequently faced left toward the enemy, the non-commissioned officers and lieutenants were in front of the riflemen, and the colors were in the rear. Needless to say, this unorthodox configuration had to be addressed. As each of the other three brigades arrived, they experienced similar confusion, and each took a few extra minutes to get things straightened out before being properly oriented to advance into the Wheatfield. In the case of Cross's deployment, the disorganization came at the expense of the 17th Maine and the 5th Michigan, who were desperately buying time. As Cross's brigade stepped over the wall at the southern edge of Trousseau Woods and then crossed the Wheatfield Road into the field, they received fire from the rightmost regiments of the Confederate line. But these soldiers of the combined 15th Georgia and 1st Texas, in the finger of woods on Houck's Ridge, at the eastern edge of the Wheatfield, fired high, having little impact on the rapid advance of Cross's regiments, and the brigade came abreast of and relieved the beleaguered 17th Maine and 5th Michigan. The 5th New Hampshire on the Union left and the 148th Pennsylvania to their right immediately engaged the two intermixed regiments of Robertson and Benning, as well as Robertson's 3rd Arkansas. Meanwhile, the 81st Pennsylvania and the 61st New York on the brigade's right fired on Luffman's 59th Georgia, positioned behind the stone wall, and the left of the 3rd Arkansas to the right of the 59th. There the advance of the 81st Pennsylvania and 61st New York stalled against the 59th Georgia, while the 148th Pennsylvania and 5th New Hampshire had continued success driving forward through the woods along Houck's Ridge. Meanwhile, the brigades of first Zook and then Kelly arrived in Trousseau Woods, and due to their same unorthodox marching configuration from the north, they deployed in the same awkward manner as did Cross. Zook's trek to the Wheatfield was via a more westerly route, and his entry into the western half of Trousseau Woods placed his fresh brigade behind the reorganizing brigades of both Tilton and Schweitzer. It was utter chaos. Tilton's men were collecting behind a wall on the west edge of the woods, and Schweitzer's regiments were slowly reestablishing lines facing south along the Wheatfield Road, where Zook's men were trying to form. The ensuing entanglement hampered Zook's brigade from advancing. Historicus, the anonymous Civil War-era author, who gained notoriety with dozens of controversial articles to the prominent post-war newspapers, described Zook's brigade's situation. He wrote, quote, "When they reached the ground, Barnes's disorganized troops impeded the advance of the brigade. 'If you can't get out of the way,' cried Zook, 'lie down and I'll march over you.'" Unquote. Historicus continues, quote, "Barnes ordered his men to lie down, and the chivalric Zook and his splendid brigade, under the personal direction of General Birney, did march over them, right into the breach." Unquote. The men of Zook's brigade picked their way carefully over the prostrate men of Schweitzer's regiments. Contrary to the melodramatic reporting of Historicus, the action was of no particular significance, as it happened frequently on Civil War battlefields when one line relieved another. Zook crossed the Wheatfield Road, into the Wheatfield, and swung toward the Stony Hill. His brigade's objective was the 3rd and 7th South Carolina, two of Kershaw's regiments who had commanded the eminence since pushing Tilton and Schweitzer off its crest, and whose flanking fire had helped drive de Trobriand and Winslow's battery out of the Wheatfield below. A half-hour earlier, after taking control of the hill, Kershaw dispatched the left wing of the 3rd South Carolina toward the batteries of Bigelow and Phillips along the Wheatfield Road. That unit also took aim at the ranks of Tilton's left and Schweitzer's right, pouring sporadic enfilading fire into the two reorganizing brigades. This fire further added to the chaos and confusion that Zook experienced on his arrival. But now, with Zook advancing toward the hill, the divided regiment was extremely vulnerable. Unfortunately, Zook did not get to see the pending success, as he was mortally wounded just as the 140th Pennsylvania crossed the Wheatfield Road. The regiment halted its advance, but after a few minutes of confusion, due to the loss of their brigade commander, the 140th resumed its attack on the 3rd South Carolina. And with the 66th and 52nd New York swinging around the right flank of the rebel regiment, Zook's brigade pushed the 3rd back into a refused defensive position. Kelly's brigade, a.k.a. the Irish Brigade, was the 3rd of the eventual 4 brigades of Caldwell's division to fight in the Wheatfield this day. While Kelly's brigade had started out ahead of Zook's en route to the Wheatfield, Zook, as earlier mentioned, had the more direct route. Additionally, on Kelly's approach, Cross was in the lead, so when the Irish brigade got close to the Wheatfield, they waited while Cross deployed, before filing left in front into a line of battle along the Wheatfield Road. Minutes after Zook's brigade carefully stepped over Barnes's men, Kelly's regiments climbed over the wall along the Wheatfield Road and followed Zook's lead into battle. Author James Woods, in his book Gettysburg, July 2nd, The Ebb and Flow of Battle, explained the timing and positioning of the Irish Brigade with respect to Zook's brigade and their subsequent movement into the Wheatfield. He writes, quote, Zook's brigade had preceded them. Being but 40 yards ahead, the Irish brigade kept on until it had completely passed behind them, unquote. The end result was that when the brigades did advance, Zook immediately engaged Kershaw, while Kelly advanced behind Zook, came abreast of Cross on the left, and then swung toward the southern end of the Stony Hill. Kelly took a line of attack toward the 7th South Carolina on Kershaw's right and the 51st Georgia on Semmes's left. After pouring flanking fire into the 5th Michigan and 17th Maine, who were buying time in the Wheatfield, the 3rd South Carolina's left section turned its attention to the advancing regiments of Zook, as de Trobriand's heroes withdrew. The pause in Zook's advance, the result of the loss of their commander, gave the 3rd's separated wings a chance to reunite, but since Zook's brigade overlapped their left, they found themselves taking fire from both the north and the east. As Zook's left regiments, the 66th and 52nd New York, continued to press the attack from the east, they slid south and now engaged the 7th South Carolina as well as the 3rd. The pressure on Kershaw's 2 right regiments continued to increase as the Irish Brigade now extended the Union line beyond Kershaw's right flank. Kelly's left pushed straight ahead into the low ground adjacent to Rose's Run, between the southern end of Stony Hill and the northern edge of Rose's Woods. A gap in the rebel line existed there between Kershaw's right and Semmes's left, and the Irish Brigade was headed for it. Anticipating Kelly's objective on his right, Kershaw did everything he could, but was unable to close the gap. Semmes's brigade advanced from the eastern edge of Bisecker Woods about a half hour after Kershaw's brigade stepped off the ridge. On the left of Semmes's line was the 50th Georgia, with the 51st Georgia to their right. Both regiments were perfect targets for enfilading fire from the Union artillery in the Peach Orchard and along the Wheatfield Road. The 2 regiments took a horrific number of casualties as they moved east toward Rose's Woods. Their respective effectiveness as fighting units was greatly diminished. Shortly after Semmes's brigade took up an initial position under the cover of the trees at the western edge of the woods, Kershaw, anticipating the pending attack by Zook and Kelly, went looking for support. In his official report he wrote, quote, "Hurried back to General Semmes, then some 150 yards to my right rear, to bring him up to meet the attack on my right, and also to bring forward my right regiment," unquote. The right regiment to which Kershaw referred was the missing 15th South Carolina. Understanding how the 15th South Carolina went missing is worthy of note here. When Kershaw's brigade stepped out of Bisecker Woods, advancing east toward the Rose Farm, the 15th South Carolina was blocked by some of Cabell's batteries and did not advance. Further exasperating the situation, a few minutes later, when Semmes's brigade moved into position poised to advance, the 15th was forced to slide further to the south so as not to be caught up in the middle of the supporting brigade. The regiment eventually advanced behind the right wing of Semmes's brigade and took up an initial position to the right rear of the Georgians when they reached Rose's Woods. They were well to the south of where Kershaw was fighting, on the Stony Hill, east and slightly north of the Rose Farm. Historical details are sparse for both Semmes's brigade and the 15th South Carolina Regiment, since both unit commanders were mortally wounded and no official reports were filed. But from the detailed writings of Kershaw and accounts of other adjacent units, it is fairly clear that Kershaw found Semmes before he was wounded, but did not find the 15th. Semmes complied with Kershaw's request for help and began moving his brigade toward the fighting. A portion of the 50th Georgia, still able to fight, moved to support the 3rd South Carolina on their left. Next, the 51st Georgia moved toward the right of the 7th South Carolina, but only got as close as about 100 yards from the right of the 7th. But it was the absence of the 549 men of the 15th South Carolina, Kershaw's largest regiment, that most seriously compromised his ability to defend his position. The gap still remained, and Kelly poured into it. The 7th South Carolina yielded to the intense fire and refused its right. With the initial successes of Kelly and Zook with respect to driving the rebels back on the Stony Hill, things looked promising for the Federals. However, Semmes's right wing and scattered pockets of Anderson's men in Rose's Woods posed a significant threat to Kelly's left and Cross's right. Thus far, Caldwell had held Brooke, his 4th Brigade, of 850 men, in reserve, but now, with Cross running out of ammunition, Caldwell ordered Brooke into the Wheatfield to relieve that beleaguered brigade. Brooke charged across the field, passing through the right wing of Cross's brigade. The 61st New York and the 81st Pennsylvania had held their position on a small ridge in the middle of the field and had been firing at Anderson from there since their initial assault some 30 minutes earlier. Brooke briefly paused just past Cross's right regiments, fired a volley at the rebel lines in the woods, and then resumed his charge. Shortly after advancing into Rose's Woods on Kelly's left, they encountered Semmes's 53rd Georgia and 10th Georgia. The opposing lines fired at each other at short range before the Confederates yielded and moved back to the cover of a stone wall at the wood's western boundary, with Brooke's regiments continuing to apply pressure. At about the same time that Brooke started his charge, Kelly was successfully pushing back the 7th South Carolina and 51st Georgia, exploiting the gap in the Confederate line that Kershaw had not been able to close. The 15th South Carolina had still not reached the right of Kershaw's line, but some battle narratives have them taking up a position in the right rear just as Kelly was advancing through the gap. This latent move helped plug the gap, but it was too little too late. With the 7th South Carolina gone from the Stony Hill, the 3rd South Carolina was left alone, with the exception of a handful of stalwart men of the 50th Georgia on their left. In minutes they were surrounded on 3 sides and forced to retire west or be captured. As the 3rd South Carolina withdrew, the 15th South Carolina joined in the retrograde movement of Kershaw's troops. Faunce describes the scene writing, quote, "The 15th had not arrived from the rear, and Kershaw did not know precisely where it was. catastrophe loomed over the 3rd. Kershaw ordered it to fall back and join the 7th near Rose's farmyard. As Kershaw followed it, from the woods he saw one of the grand sights of that day's battle. Wolford's brigade was coming in splendid style, unquote. The Stony Hill had been cleared of Confederate soldiers by Zook and Kelly. Brooks's sweeping charge through the Wheatfield, along with Cross's stubborn determination to keep the rebels at bay on the eastern side, resulted in Caldwell's division accomplishing much of the task of rescuing the crumbling Union left. Harry Fonts writes, quote, "At this time the colors of the Union regiments waved over a north-south line from Trousseau Woods, across the Stony Hill, to near the west front of Rose's Woods. The Wheatfield was again in Federal hands, and except for the Confederate presence at Devil's Den, Sickles' position on the left had been recovered." It had been about an hour or so since Anderson and Kershaw had successfully completed their attack from the south and west respectively, pushing the Federals out of the Wheatfield and taking control. As has been shown, that control was short-lived, as Caldwell's counterattack had reversed the rebels' fortunes. Control of the Wheatfield had changed hands again, as the Confederates were pushed out and the 2nd Corps regiments retook possession of the trampled grain field for the Union. But just as before, the tables were about to turn yet again. General McLaws had a fresh brigade in Wofford, over 1,600 men, and they were headed directly at the Wheatfield. Semmes's, Kershaw's, and Anderson's men, too, all still had lots of fight left. On the Union side, the brigades of Burbank and Day, over 900 and 1,500 men respectively, from Ayres's division of Sykes's 5th Corps, were on the eastern edge of the Wheatfield. And Crawford's 5th Corps division of over 2,800 men was taking up positions on the western slopes of Little Round Top. 2 hours into this battle, with about an hour before sunset, this fight was far from over. Visit our website to register to use this app and explore anywhere, anytime on the battlefield. www.civilwaranimatedbattles.com